Good morning. Bonjour à tous. Public service is deeply important to me. I served our country in the military. Now I have the honor of serving as a member of Parliament and leader of Her Majesty's loyal opposition. That service is rooted in respect for all Canadians and love for our great country. Et j'ai des hautes attentes envers mes collègues parce que j'ai des hautes attentes envers moi-même. Je crois en ce pays et je crois en la noblesse de le servir. At my core, I believe that to whom much is given, much is expected. And if there is one thing that is expected of politicians, is that they will govern with proper morals and ethics, putting the good of the country above their own. Ultimately, it boils down to trust. Évidemment, il n'y a aucun doute que ce gouvernement est incompétent depuis plusieurs années et on le voit par les mauvaises gestions. In questioning the government these past few months, our party has uncovered a trove of compromising information. And through the sophisticated web of a glamorous charity and of influence, a pattern started to arise. The more the Prime Minister's family and friends were being handsomely rewarded for talks and flown around the world like VIPs, the more the government handsomely rewarded the We Charity. Un organisme de charité, la We Charity, est devenu une extension du Parti libéral. Même message, même valeur et même adoration pour Justin Trudeau. Mais pire encore, on a vite découvert plus la We Charity récompensait les membres de la famille Trudeau, plus le gouvernement Trudeau récompensait la We Charity. C'est un lien qui brise la confiance des Canadiens. It is the duty of the opposition to stand up for Canadians when their own government is busy filling the pockets of supporters than they are transferring health funds to the provinces or preparing for a second wave of COVID-19. The sheer audacity of awarding a nearly $1 billion contract to be run by a liberal insider charity during a pandemic with no debate and no oversight cannot be overstated. New details continue to emerge that paint a concerning picture of potential corruption at very high levels of the government. The We Charity secretly lobbied the Trudeau government dozens of times and never registered to do so. This is just further proof that the Canadian Student Service Grant Program was never about helping students. It was about helping out friends of the Prime Minister. The Ethics Commissioner is investigating. The Conservatives have written to the RCMP, and the Lobbying Commissioner is asking them to investigate as well. The Ombudsman is investigating, and Conservatives have written to the RCMP. We will continue to hold Mr. Trudeau and his government accountable, and we will keep fighting for the answers that we believe Canadians deserve. Nous savons que Justin Trudeau est devenu Premier ministre et le oui commençait déjà à payer les membres de sa famille. Au cours des 5 dernières années, ces paiements sont plus d'un demi-million de dollars. We know that Justin Trudeau's government has rewarded we with multiple sole source contracts over the last 5 years, well before they ever came up with the Canada Student Service Grant. We know that we employed a member of the finance minister's family and that the Morneau family went on 2 luxury vacations paid for by we. We know that we was facing significant financial challenges and that they sent 2 separate proposals to various Liberal ministers to help them out. And we know that Justin Trudeau and Bill Morneau turned around and handed their friends at we a $1 billion management contract or funds to manage under the guise of supporting youth during the pandemic. Les libéraux doivent immédiatement arrêter ce camouflage, rendre les documents publics, dire la vérité aux Canadiens et laisser le Parlement faire son travail. S'il n'y a rien d'incriminant dans ces documents, rien n'explique pourquoi les libéraux consacreraient autant de temps et de ressources à les cacher. Mais on se demande encore combien de choses que nous ne savons pas. After a prorogation, after relentless filibusters, piles on piles of delay and political games. And now, the Liberals are threatening an election in the middle of a pandemic to avoid any further scrutiny. In many parts of Canada, kids can't go trick-or-treating, but the Liberals think Canadians should go to the polls rather than they're answering several simple questions. They don't want the truth to come out. This cover-up is becoming quite desperate. And quand Justin Trudeau s'est fait prendre, il a essayé de se cacher. Il a offert des réponses préfabriquées. Il a remis des documents noircis. Il a fait de l'obstruction en comité. Et après tout cela, il a fermé le gouvernement. Et le Parlement n'a pas siégé pour 6 longues semaines durant une pandémie historique. Today, I will be introducing the Conservative Opposition Day motion. We are proposing to establish a committee to look into the various ethical problems the government has in the handing out of COVID-19 contracts to close friends and family members. It is a committee that will examine the misuse of taxpayer dollars during the worst crisis most Canadians have experienced in their lifetime. Canadians were worried about their future during the pandemic. The Liberals were worried about their friends. The Liberal government's COVID-19 response has been plagued with ethical lapses, and these are the ones we know about. The Prime Minister's decision to prorogue Parliament to avoid the growing number of unanswered questions has proven that this committee is needed now more than ever for parliamentary accountability. To ensure the work needed to get the answers Canadians deserve does not interfere with regular important work of the House and their network of committees. Therefore, a special committee with a dedicated mandate needs to be established. This committee will examine and review the Canada Student Service Grant, the relationships between the We Charity and the Liberal government and their families, the lobbying efforts for amendments to the Income Tax Act in respect of the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy Program, the acquisition, purchase, and approval of Baylis Medical Company ventilators, and topics other health committees identify related to the Liberal government's COVID-19 response. The committee's initial work will be supported by the disclosure of documents which the Liberal government has not provided and continuously resist providing. Il est temps de remettre de l'ordre dans notre maison et de rebâtir la confiance des Canadiens. C'est la première mission d'un gouvernement qui dirige en temps de crise. Il faut unir les citoyens. Il faut arrêter d'avoir deux lignes, une pour les amis libéraux et une pour nous tous. This motion will be amended today, as well to make clear that the appointment of a special committee on allegations of misuse of public funds by the government during the COVID-19 pandemic in Canada shall not constitute legitimate grounds for calling a general election. C'est une question de responsabilité du gouvernement, mais pas d'une élection. To whom much is given, much is expected. Canadians expect the truth. They deserve accountability. That's what this committee will do. Thank you, and I'm happy to take your questions.
We'll now take questions, starting with questions on the phone. A quick reminder, one question, one follow-up per reporter. Nous allons maintenant prendre les questions, commençant par les questions au téléphone. Un court rappel, une question suivie par journaliste. We have 6 questions total. Operator, do we have a first questions?
Thank you. Merci. Please press star 1 at this time if you have a question. S'il vous plaît, appuyez sur étoile 1 maintenant pour poser une question. The first question, la première question, is from Raymond Filion, TVA. Please go ahead. Your line is open. Votre ligne est ouverte.
Merci. Bonjour, M. O'Toole. Je comprends que vous avez amendé le texte de votre motion. Là, vous ne voulez pas d'élection, mais n'empêche que le gouvernement a déjà menacé d'en faire une question de confiance. Alors, est-ce que vous êtes prêt à aller jusqu'en élection s'il le faut pour faire adopter votre motion?
Cette motion, c'est une question de responsabilité et pas d'une élection. On a des questions raisonnables après la pandémie et après le scandale, oui. Et on va travailler avec les autres partis pour poser des questions spécifiques sur ce scandale. Et ce n'est pas une question pour une élection, mais pour la responsabilité.
Je comprends que vous n'en faites pas une question d'élection, mais le gouvernement, lui, dit qu'il va en faire une question de confiance. Alors, le cas échéant, allez-vous quand même insister pour que ça passe, quitte à provoquer des élections?
C'est dommage qu'après une pandémie, après une prorogation, après M. Monod, il a démissionné, après les délais au comité, on a des questions raisonnables. Ce n'est pas notre priorité d'avoir une élection, mais les Canadiens ont besoin des réponses. Les Canadiens ont besoin de la vérité. Et c'est pourquoi on a cette motion aujourd'hui.
Opérateur, prochaine question.
Thank you. Merci. La prochaine question, the next question is from Daniel Leblanc, Radio-Canada. Please go ahead, your line is open. Votre ligne est ouverte.
Bonjour, M. O'Toole. Petite question, juste un petit changement de sujet sur la question de la nomination des juges par le gouvernement Trudeau. Est-ce que, premièrement, est-ce que vous êtes d'accord que le processus actuel est ouvert et transparent et qu'est-ce que vous aimeriez voir comme mesure suite aux révélations ce matin?
Merci, Daniel. Ce matin, j'ai entendu les nouvelles et c'est troublant. On va poser quelques questions aujourd'hui sur cet enjeu. Et c'est juste comme le scandale, oui. Le gouvernement Trudeau a une approche avec des règles pour les amis libéraux et des règles pour tous les autres Canadiens. C'est inapproprié et on va poser les questions.
Est-ce que vous aimeriez voir une enquête parlementaire, par exemple, au Sénat, et ça a été soulevé par certains membres de votre caucus?
Je vais parler aujourd'hui avec mon cabinet fantôme et particulièrement notre porte-parole pour la justice. Probablement, on va examiner au comité.
Operator, next question.
Thank you. Merci. La prochaine question, the next question is from Mélanie Marquis, La Presse. Please go ahead, your line is open. Votre ligne est ouverte.
Oui, bonjour, M. O'Toole. Je comprends que vous allez amender le texte de la motion qu'on avait déjà sous la main pour préciser qu'on ne devrait pas aller en élection à cause de ça, mais est-ce que vous êtes prêt à d'autres amendements, par exemple, qui pourraient venir des néo-démocrates ou du Bloc québécois, pardon?
Merci, Mélanie. Nous sommes en train de parler avec les autres partis sur cette motion avant le débat aujourd'hui. Particulièrement, tous les partis ont des questions sur le scandale, oui. Il y a beaucoup de questions d'éthique, de la langue nationale, de dépenses du gouvernement, des questions sur la situation avec M. Marneau et la famille de M. Trudeau. Donc, on va travailler en étroite collaboration avec le Bloc et l'NDP pour le débat aujourd'hui.
Avez-vous...
Oui, excusez-moi. We will work with the opposition parties on a variety of questions that many people have on everything from ethics to official languages to lobbying to questions around Mr. Morneau's resignation, the situation with Mr. Trudeau and speaker fees. So we hope to show that this is about accountability and not about an election.
Puis avez-vous obtenu donc justement la garantie soit du NPD ou du Bloc québécois qui vont voter pour votre motion?
On va voir. On a eu des discussions avec les autres partis et on va examiner leurs enjeux. C'est pourquoi je vais proposer les amendements spécifiques sur le scandale, de démontrer notre intention. Ce n'est pas pour une élection, mais c'est pour les questions raisonnables.
And we'll now go to questions in the room.
Good morning. The Liberals seem to be implying that the term anti-corruption is expressing non-confidence in the government, that if you have a committee called an anti-corruption committee, that in and of itself is expressing non-confidence in the government. Can you respond to that, please?
We're changing the name. This is not about an election, as Mr. Trudeau would like. It's about reasonable questions that he has avoided through the use of prorogation, through the resignation of his finance minister, from hours of delay and obfuscation at committee. What are they really hiding from? So we're changing the name of the committee, and we're putting a specific amendment to say that this is not about an election. So we will see whether it's just more Liberal hiding or whether they're willing to answer questions.
Is the name the only main difference between what you were proposing and what the Liberals were proposing? And if not, what else is the difference there?
Well, the Liberals spent well over $300 billion in about 5 or 6 months. They would rather deliver 500 boxes full of spending documents and bog down Parliament for months rather than us bring in 3 boxes of the documents they've been avoiding to give us, or to remove the blacking out of documents to hide what they actually contain. So which is more reasonable? What the Liberals are trying to do, or our specific reasonable questions? I think Canadians see what's going on here. Threatening an election rather than being accountable for a prime minister who's already on his 3rd personal ethics investigation. It's time for some accountability, and we're going to bring that.
Mackenzie?
Hi, Mr. O'Toole. Mackenzie Gray with CTV News. You did a live stream with Alberta Premier Jason Kenney. You sat side by side. You didn't wear any masks. You said that it's going to be 4 months until you can get COVID again. Up until this point, public health advice has been that you should wear a mask or stay 6 feet apart from someone. Health Canada advice says that we don't know the period of immunity that you have. Do you regret not wearing a mask with Premier Kenney?
Thanks, Mackenzie, for the question. And it's important to reiterate to Canadians that we should all follow social distancing, mask usage, sanitation, all the measures during the pandemic, particularly with the second wave. And I have done so in every province I've been in. And in fact, I use my own experience with COVID-19 and that of our family to make sure that people are vigilant. So I respect those rules in every province I'm in, including in Alberta.
Okay, so you're respecting the rules, but you're still sitting beside the Premier of the province. You were running to be Prime Minister. Your party got very upset with Prime Minister Trudeau when he crossed over to Quebec earlier in the pandemic, saying that he broke the rules. Seems quite clear to me that the rules are that you should be wearing a mask or staying 6 feet apart. Again, do you regret not following the rules in this case and showing to Canadians that you're taking this as seriously as other leaders have been?
Well, Mackenzie, we were distant as we sat away from one another at a webcast event where everyone broadcasting this webcast, because there was no gathering, it was taped and webcast on the internet, and we were distanced. And coming up to the stage and leaving, we had a mask. Much like I'm doing now with you, you're not in a mask, I'm not in a mask. There's times you take your mask off and put it back on. That's what we followed that day in Alberta. And I want to commend the UCP for running probably, I think, the first very large-scale virtual political convention. And they did that out of the need to be responsible, and we will be.
Marika?
Marika Walsh with the Globe and Mail. Mr. O'Toole, do you and your party have confidence in this government?
Well, that's a great question, because confidence can sometimes trigger an election. But confidence is actually inherent in the role I have as opposition leader. When a month ago I asked the Prime Minister to de-escalate the situation in Nova Scotia, he and the minister did nothing. And I don't have confidence in how they're proceeding on that file, which is why we're asking questions. We are asking questions about the accountability of taxpayer dollars in the course of a pandemic and with insider friends getting access. We don't have confidence on how that was handled. But does that lack of confidence in a file or a committee work translate into the need for an election? No. We have an obligation, constitutional obligation, to ask questions and to hold the government to account. Mr. Trudeau has already used prorogation. They're using obfuscation and delay at committee. They're using resignation of ministers to avoid accountability. If he now wants to trigger an election, the Liberal Party would rather send people to the polls during the second wave of a pandemic than answer a few reasonable questions. I think Canadians should be concerned by that.
Okay, so you do have confidence in the overall government, is what I take from that answer. On another issue, you were very critical.
Well, let me correct you there, because confidence in the parliamentary sense usually means a confidence vote leading to the defeat of the government. There has never, to our research,
That's not what I asked you, though.
you just said I have confidence in the government. I do not. Do I want to have a general election? I do not want that either. But we are not going to allow Mr. Trudeau to continue to play games using prorogation, using hiding and people reading, nursery rhymes and other things into the record rather than answering questions. Canadians should wonder why he's willing to do all this rather than just release a few documents. So confidence in the parliamentary term means a vote that can trigger an election. We're not going to let Mr. Trudeau suggest that our reasonable questions about a spending scandal mean we want to force a general election.
Okay, and you were critical of the Ontario government's response, saying that Alberta has had a stronger response to the pandemic compared to other provinces, including your own. What specifically do you think that the provincial government has gotten wrong?
Well, my comments were not about what provinces got wrong. My comments were being positive on Mr. Kenney. So Alberta has had a tracing app, for example, long before any other province, long before the federal government, which still does not have a functioning national tracing app. The premiers, all premiers, including Premier Kenney, Premier Legault, Premier Ford, Premier Horgan, have all had to step up to a higher degree because the federal government was late on the border for the first wave of the pandemic. The federal government has not fulfilled the promises Mr. Trudeau made in March for rapid testing, for tracing. They failed on both measures. We don't have the rollout of rapid tests. So the premiers have had to be nimble and have had to respond even quicker because of the absence of federal leadership. And where some provinces have done things even faster than one another, we should have lessons learned so that for the second wave, we can learn from the first.
Last question, dernière question. David?
Hi, good morning, Mr. O'Toole. David Thurton, CBC News. So just to be clear, what amendments are you willing to make? How are you willing to meet the other parties halfway this special committee?
Thank you for the question, David. We've been speaking to the NDP about a different name for the committee. That seems reasonable to us, so we're going to propose an amendment. We're speaking to the other parties about the mandate of the committee, and I think that's reasonable as well. Right now, we have several officers of Parliament, from the Ethics Commissioner to the Languages Commissioner, studying things related to we. We've got several committees wanting to study things related to we that are being blocked by the Liberals. So let's take all of those questions to one, specialized committee of a name that we all agree on that will examine all questions related to the we insider scandal. And I think it's reasonable. We hope that the amendment we're going to add stating that creation of a committee is not grounds for a general election will also show the government that the opposition parties don't want them to play games. We just want them to answer questions.
Okay. I just wanted to ask you a question about the situation that's happening in Southwest Nova Scotia. Yesterday, we heard from Minister Mark Miller, the Minister of Indigenous Services, that the police basically let down the community, the Indigenous community there. Do you agree with those comments?
Minister Miller's government has let down Canadians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And in fact, we've been raising this countless times over the last number of months. I spoke to the Prime Minister personally about it. I spoke to Chief Bellegarde personally about this concern. And for them to be bringing an emergency debate on their own failure of leadership should concern Canadians. And one thing that has united all voices in this area of the country that's frustrated right now, Indigenous leaders, commercial fishers and union leaders, they've all been disappointed with the response of the federal government. The Liberal Premier, Premier McNeil, has been disappointed with the lack of response of the Liberal government. So we're going to continue to ask for the government to show an ability to get tensions down, a mediated discussion on how we can fulfill the constitutional safeguard of Indigenous fishery, alongside the ability for rural communities in Nova Scotia to find balance for a way of life. I know it can be done. Leadership is hard. The Liberal government prefers photo ops than actual action. So I'd ask Minister Miller to get working.
This concludes the press conference. Ici me fait la conférence de presse. Merci.